Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. You're watching Alaska Weather, and thanks so much for doing so tonight. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information. You can do that easily by calling the Alaska Weather Information Line at 1-800-472-0391. Find us online anytime at weather.gov/Alaska, and if you can't find what you need or have a special question or just want to share a picture or video of your part of Alaska, we'd love to see it. Send it anytime to david.snyder@noaa.gov. On to the weather at hand now. The wind, as we were talking about yesterday, is really going to pick up around the Juneau area starting early tomorrow morning. A high wind warning will be in effect for mainly the Juneau area thanks to a Taku wind. The winds could come up to around 60 miles per hour or so be prepared for some stronger gusts in the region. Now, this won't likely affect the larger Lynn Canal region, as this isn't coming out of the passes and out of the north. This is more of that Taku wind. In this case, it looks like most of this will probably blow the strongest during the day, starting in the morning hours, and then diminish as we get into the evening. So kind of a one-day short sail there. A look up north shows that a lot of wind will be moving through the interior and the northern coast as well. All these yellow shaded areas are winter weather advisories, and this will mainly be due to a lowered visibility as the wind is blowing through the region. Now, for the interior, including areas around Fairbanks, this is mainly going to be across the highway past summits there, so not necessarily down in town. Watch for poor visibility that could approach about a half mile at times, and when that happens, it may be a little bit difficult to see, and gusts up to 35, maybe even 45 miles per hour at times may be part of your day there. The strongest wind, though, will be up around the eastern Beaufort Seacoast, where winds could be as strong as 50 miles per hour, and so plan for some stronger gusts in that region there. All of this will continue at least through about midnight tonight, and in some cases for the central and eastern interior as we get into the daytime tomorrow before the winds start to diminish. So plan on kind of a blustery day if you're in any of these yellow shaded areas tomorrow. Here's the big weather picture. Low pressure is spinning up right now across the northern Gulf, and as it does so, it's kind of gathering its whereabouts to kind of get things together. It's been putting snow down heavy at times around Girdwood and Seward. If you're in those areas, we'd love to see some pictures, and we would certainly love to get your snow reports as well. Up north, not a whole lot of snow is falling out of these clouds, but the wind sure is blowing as high pressure up north around 1,050 millibars is pushing southward pretty strong. And with that, temperatures are falling. The frontal boundary is pushing its way out to the west and south, and all of that air is draining into and really being vacuumed up by the low pressure system that's forming across the northern Gulf. All of this is working together as well to bring wind out of the Taku Valley. So this is going to be a developing situation in southeast and continues to be a snowing situation across south central. Now, this won't be a big snowstorm for many locations north of the Kenai Peninsula, including Anchorage. Don't be surprised to see a few snow showers and some light accumulations, but generally speaking, this is going to be a Prince William Sound event and mainly a Kenai Fjords and eastern Kenai Peninsula event. Out across the west, that colder air continues to push southward. You can see the boundary here across the Bering Sea. That's working its way west and south. And for all the locations up north in the interior, this is going to be mostly a wind event. As you can see by the weather map today, we have low pressure stretched out across the northern Gulf, 1,004 millibars for that area of low pressure now across the Kenai Peninsula and just outside of Prince William Sound. Each one of these waves of low pressure working from east to west across the interior is helping to focus the wind a little bit more. And every time one of those moves across the region, the wind comes up a little bit and then it may settle down. But you'll see each one of these kind of lined up in succession as it passes from right to left on your screen there. Across the eastern part of the Gulf, another wave develops. That's at around 990 millibars. This is working its way northward, and as it does so, don't be surprised to run into some spotty areas of rain and snow showers generally around the Dixon entrance and points south. A bigger, more organized system, though, will be what we find around Kodiak Island, southwest, and south central tonight. And for most areas in south central, this will be kind of a quick hit of snow. There could be some areas across Moose Pass to Turnagain Arm, Turnagain Pass, I should say, up toward Prince William Sound that pick up a good 1 to 2 feet of snow. And that's not going to be the case for the Anchorage area, but there will be snow in the region and into the valley. A look up north shows a tight packing of the pressure gradient there, those lines of black or the lines of constant pressure. And the tighter they get together, the faster the wind's got to move. And so we know that especially on the summits there and on the ridge lines, there will be some pretty hefty gusts at times that could blow the snow that's already on the ground around and make it harder to see where you're going there. So some of that could drop to about half mile or so. Might be some areas of fog way out across the Bering. Most of that won't impact too many people there. And way out to the west, you can get a hint of the next weather maker that's trying to shape up. It really doesn't go very far as we get into Thursday, stalling out thanks to this extensive area of high pressure up north. Again, that was around 1,050 millibars, and its influence is stretching all the way into the Bering Sea. Low pressure that was over south central moves a little bit further west, and you can see that over the YK Delta as we get into Thursday afternoon. At 999 millibars, it's not really a terribly strong system, but it's all relative. So when we put these numbers here, the numbers help us kind of gauge at first, is this a strong system or is this a weak system, or is it about status quo? Well, when you compare that to the high pressure system up north, suddenly that difference is just as great as if this was 950 and we had a high pressure system of 1,000. It's still a 50 millibar difference. So there's a lot of air moving through here, and a big difference helps to make that happen. Low pressure across the central and eastern Gulf will keep the rain going across parts of southeast as we warm up. This weather system still trekking northward, and as we get into Friday, you can see there's still precipitation chances across the outer coast and down into southern parts of southeast as the low moves into the central Gulf waters. Low pressure moves off the YK Delta by Friday, and there will still be blowing snow in places like Savunga and Gamble on the Seward Peninsula and across the northern coast there, though there won't be any active snow falling in any great variety. It does mainly look to focus that best precipitation chance across parts of the upper Kuskokwim and probably the lower to mid Yukon Valley. Across the Aleutians now, the attention turns to you at a 981 millibar load, bringing in a southerly flow to Unalaska, Dutch Harbor, Nikolsky, and Akutan, and the southern end of the Alaska Peninsula. And there's a chance for some rain out across the western areas before that colder air reaches into you. Speaking of which, let's take a look at temperatures here. Across southeast tonight, upper 20s and lower 30s for you. Some of you just barely staying above freezing across Sitka, Craig, Klawock, out toward Ketchikan. South Central, lower 30s tonight, 33 in Kodiak as you move up the Parks Highway. Temperatures cool off around Healy to about 11, about the same there in Fairbanks. 2 below in Fort Yukon, 5 to maybe 15 below across the North Slope. Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse about 9 below. Nome looking for a low of 6 degrees southwest. Teens and 20s tonight. King Salmon about 28. And it looks like most of the chain and the Alaska Peninsula will hover in the 20s and 30s. And temperatures warm up a little bit more tomorrow. Most places out west should make it just above freezing. St. Paul and St. George pretty close to 30 tomorrow. For the Wasilla and Parks Highway corridor down toward Anchorage and Kenai, temps will hover pretty close to 40 degrees for your Thursday afternoon. Upper 30s to mid 40s for many in southeast. The interior, lower 30s there, most above freezing. Single digits for most of the North Slope, the Seward Peninsula, Shishmaref, Nome, Kotzebue, and northward into Kotzebue Sound. Teens tomorrow with Unalakleet about 27. Lows overnight on Friday. The coldest spots up north, anywhere from 5 to 10 below, including Arctic Village at 11 below, 11 above in Fairbanks. Tanana, Ambler, Bettle, single digits and low teens. Southwest, including McGrath, back in the mid-20s, or mid-teens to low 20s. South Central back in the lower to mid-20s for low temperatures Friday morning. 34 in Kodiak and 31 in Unalaska, Dutch Harbor. Juneau about 28 with a high of 44. As we get into Friday, it looks like Fairbanks will set up above freezing.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
On to flying weather now. IFR conditions will be focused on the Alaska Range on the eastern side of the western end of the mountains, and also around the Kenai Mountains and the Chugach Range there, as low pressure is pushing moisture up against some of those higher terrain spots. Also on the North Slope, watch for patchy areas of IFR, generally north of Adigan and Anaktuvik Pass, and then out across the western Aleutians as we start up our Thursday, as the next wave of weather is lingering out there. You'll see a lot of focus in kind of a stationary area of poor visibility, rain and maybe some snow in that region. Out west, the Bering just covered up with MVFR. Most areas along the west coast also experiencing that. You'll notice improvements along the western Alaska Range just east of Lake Iliamna through Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, probably still holding around IFR, but improvements around Rainy Pass and then eastward toward Windy and Isabel Passes, and Tanita and Mentasta Pass look pretty good by the afternoon. Across southeast, conditions should be improving visibility and ceiling-wise. However, keep in mind the turbulence is going to become a factor, and you'll see that here in just a minute. Thursday will not be the easiest day to fly for some of that reason. Now for Friday morning, look for IFR conditions up across the north. Once again, that'll be a morning issue, it looks like, for most areas there. Out west, IFR conditions spread north and east away from Attu and Kiska. Look for some improvements just south of Sand Point. IFR conditions will be spotty across the west and not across the Gulf. MVFR is starting to sneak back into the Dixon entrance as well. As we get into Friday afternoon, once again, improvements across the North Slope, though MVFR may be found around AKwx and Barrow, so keep your eyes on that. Maybe as far south and west as Wainwright as well. IFR conditions limited to the open waters of the Bering, with MVFR still fairly widespread across the YK Delta. Not so much around Bristol Bay, but lingering over Kodiak Island. VFR conditions prevail for Friday for most of the interior and a large part of southeast, though you're starting to get more of that wetter and lower ceiling and poor visibility influence there showing up across central and southern parts of the Panhandle. Let's take a look at your pass conditions in detail now. Anaktuvuk and Adigan Pass, we expect to see improvements during the day, VFR perhaps by the afternoon, and the same should be said as we get into your Friday as well. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass look like we'll see IFR really through most of the day, but Friday looks a lot better as you just saw. But pay attention, the Western Alaska Range, especially those southern passes, are going to have a little more trouble for your Thursday than what you'll see on Friday. For Thursday, Rainy Pass also looking for improvements toward MVFR by the afternoon. Windy Pass goes all the way back to VFR conditions as we get into Windy and Isabel Pass, similar conditions there, and a lot more on the clear side and fair weather side as you get into the interior, though you're going to have some turbulence issues there as well. Mentasta Pass looking for VFR conditions there. Tanita Pass looking for some improvements as the day goes on tomorrow. And Portage Pass also looking for improvements, but not all the way to VFR, though you will find better visibility and ceilings there as you get into the Anchorage region, but again, you're going to run into turbulence problems there. Chilkoot and White Pass also expected to be VFR through most of the day. Here's your freezing levels. The surface freezing line taking a big dig southward across the Bering, hovering around the Gulf there with levels climbing across southern southeast to 2, 4, even 6,000 feet just south of Haida Gwaii. Most of the interior, of course, it's going to start out below freezing. Icing potential limited to areas generally above 8,000 feet for southeast tomorrow in that isolated moderate range. The west coast, though, lower than 8,000 feet. We've got a lot of moisture and enough cold there that this is actually a pretty tall order there for the Seward Peninsula, Kotzebue Sound down to the YK Delta and Kodiak Island. So watch out for that. Icing threats will be climbing there and below 10,000 feet out in the west. So a lot of moisture moving in across the western region. The jet stream right now has a split flow. You can see the main corridor of faster moving winds, though, is working its way back into southwestern Alaska, only at 60 knots, though, but it's breaking off of that really fast corridor that's traveling around 150 to 160 knots, ridging across eastern Alaska, and that deep southerly flow punching right up through the heart of Alaska today. At 9,000 feet, we've got low pressure across the eastern Gulf. Winds still moving offshore for southeast. That deep southerly flow working across the western half of the state, and a continental flow really for most of the interior. Wind speeds there about 30 to 40 knots. At 3,000 feet, you can see not a big change here for the interior. 20 to 30 knots from the east and southeast. Low pressure sitting across southwestern Alaska, helping to draw in more of a south and easterly flow over the Kenai Peninsula and Kodiak Island, anywhere from 20 to 40 knots, and our offshore flow continues for southeast between 20 and 40 as well. Stronger winds developing out west between 50 and 60 knots. So there will be turbulence out west below 4,000 feet. For southern southeast below 4,000 feet, watch for areas of considerable moderate from Sitka all the way down toward Ketchikan, Craig, Klawock, and Annette. Across Eagle, look for some chop there, and also across the Yukon Valley and parts of southwest during the daytime tomorrow. Your marine weather in just a moment.
Leatherbacks are the largest turtles on Earth, growing up to 7 feet long and weighing more than 2,000 pounds. These sea turtles are among the most highly migratory animals on Earth, some traveling up to 10,000 miles a year between their nesting and feeding grounds. Prevalent in every ocean except the Arctic and Antarctic, the species overall is declining, more so in the Pacific. In the eastern Pacific, the Mexican population was once thought to be the largest in the world and has experienced an alarming decline.
This trajectory of decline that we've seen and actually collapse. We're talking about only 20 or 30 turtles nesting every year, where thousands used to just 40 years ago. That's the kind of dramatic decline.
The Western Pacific population has been declining steadily, and it's particularly critical to act now before it collapses, while there are enough turtles in nests to respond to conservation measures. But threats to all leatherbacks in the Pacific need to be addressed.
The top threats to populations are uncontrolled coastal development, all the bad stuff on the nesting beaches, egg harvest, poaching of the females, predation on the eggs by dogs and pigs. Deforestation makes the sand too warm and dry and the eggs don't hatch. Another one is incidental capture in fishing gear. During their vast migrations, they get caught in fishing gear throughout the Pacific. And finally, marine debris, which the leatherbacks mistake for their favorite food, jellyfish, and they choke on those.
Protecting leatherbacks in U.S. waters alone is not enough to ensure the continued existence of the species. The highly migratory nature of Pacific leatherbacks requires cooperation and international collaboration. NOAA is focusing on partnerships with Mexico, Central America, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands in the Pacific.
Our action plan promotes a holistic recovery strategy that addresses all the sources of mortality. So that's basically ensuring that the remaining nesting sites are protected. And the nests produce as many hatchlings as possible. And then secondly, in tandem with that, is reducing the fisheries-related mortalities. We're working with international partners to incentivize community participation on the nesting beach conservation and developing alternative livelihood programs that wean communities off leatherback resources and introduce alternative methods for food and income. Recovery is going to take a long time, on the order of 20 to 30 years at least, before we see some of these actions bear fruit. But here in the US, we can all help leatherbacks by making seafood choices, for instance, that support sustainable fishing practices. And beachgoers can certainly do their part by keeping our oceans clean of plastic debris, picking up marine litter, particularly plastic bags.
Together with our partners, we are strengthening protection and conservation efforts to ensure a future for leatherbacks, helping them to survive and once again thrive in the waters of the Pacific Ocean.
For over 40 years, NOAA scientists have been collecting data and piecing together the story of the gray whale. Each year, new discoveries are made, revealing the secrets of this ancient traveler. With the northeastern Pacific population recovered, leading scientists from the NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center continue their research efforts to help save the western population from extinction. The most effective way to identify individuals and count the population is to photograph them from the surface. Using the gray whale's distinctive markings and gray spots caused by parasites on their skin, scientists document these characteristics to identify individuals.
So we're able to track migratory pathways and corridors by the simple use of photo identification. There are other ways to do that as well, biopsy sampling and genetics.
And from the air.
Aerial photography is one way you can study animals based on their size and shape. So you can learn a lot about nutritive and reproductive condition of whales just by measuring their size and shape from vertical aerial photographs.
You can also put satellite transmitters on them and track them remotely. You put the transmitter on and let them go, and you watch them move across the Pacific or down to China or wherever it might be.
To further learn and discover where these great sojourners swim, the team of researchers traveled to Russia and set up camp on Sakhalin Island.
The main focus of our research while we were on Sakhalin was to collect photo identification. If it was a whale that we had not collected a genetic sample from previously, we would also attempt to collect a sample from the whales.
Whereas whales are endowed with natural insulation, their human observers must gear up to brave the cold in order to study these marine giants up close.
We're typically only able to work about 1/3 of the time that we're there, and that's mostly due to this fog that just invades the area and sits sometimes for weeks on end. So it can be very challenging to try and do field work in this site.
Recently, 2 whales from the western population surprised scientists by migrating across the Pacific to the waters of California and Mexico.
It's a really fun finding. It's added another piece to the puzzle that we didn't previously know about. And I would have to say that it's opened up more questions than we had before.
Research scientists from Japan, Russia, and the United States share images of animals they've spotted.
We take a photograph of an individual off of Sakhalin Island, and we get a phone call from Japanese scientists, and they say, hey, guess what? We've got a picture of a gray whale in Japan. We say, can you send it to us? We'd love to try and match it. They'll send us the picture, we'll compare it to our catalog, and they'll say, hey, we've got a match from Sakhalin to Japan.
Unlike many species of whales that still remain on the endangered species list, the eastern Pacific gray whale, once on the brink of extinction, now numbers about 20,000 individuals. Recovery efforts that started 40 years ago and the ongoing research and monitoring by NOAA scientists have contributed to the conservation of the gray whales. Together, with legal protection and public education, scientists are playing their part to ensure the survival of this magnificent migratory animal.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Time for a quick check of your sea ice edge, and we've got some warm water sitting just north of St. Lawrence Island that's really kind of melting out an awful lot of this ice here north of Gamble and north of Savunga. Even as colder air is moving out of the Arctic in the next several days, including tonight, a lot of this will probably not freeze over very quickly, if at all. So some changes out there just south of the Bering Strait. The other thing we're seeing is a lot of this ice will be on the move, probably from north to northeast to south and southwest. But the further south it goes, the warmer waters are, and chances are a lot of that will be breaking up, at least in part. Not entirely, we're not there yet. The north coast, you'll notice still plenty of 80% plus concentration, although there are some areas with polynyas south of Point Lay to just north of Point Hope. Here's a look at the weather now in southeast. As we get into Thursday, remember we were talking about the winds coming up. Gusts to 50 knots in Lynn Canal, but not storm force for the entire region. Gusts to 45 in Stevens Passage. And again, the Taku wind bringing up high winds for the Juneau area, probably for most of the daytime hours tomorrow. An easterly offshore flow or off mountain flow for the Dixon entrance and the Clarence Strait region, and then an off outer coast flow, an offshore flow there, 25 to 45 knots. Stronger winds down south outside of the Dixon entrance with seas up to 16 feet. You'll notice the winds stay up as we get into Friday, anywhere from 30 knots to 45 knots. The strongest winds just outside of the Dixon entrance. Northerlies from the Lynn Canal through Stevens Passage, still yielding gusts up to 45 knots with a southeast flow in the Clarence Strait, 20 knots with 4-foot seas there on Friday. In south central, not nearly as windy. Northeasterlies 15 knots there with 5-foot seas. Easterlies across the northern Gulf around 20 knots with 7-foot seas, 8-foot seas across the Barrens, and north and easterly winds down Cook Inlet at 20 knots for Thursday. On Friday, improving winds there. Northerlies coming down Cook Inlet 10 to 15 knots with 3 to 4-foot seas. Northeasterlies in the northern Gulf around 20 knots with 9 to 11-foot seas, and a light wind and small seas inside of Prince William Sound for Friday. In Bristol Bay, look for west and southwesterly winds around 15 knots. Small seas only 2 to 4 feet there. Across Kodiak Island, and east and south wind around 15 to 20 knots with 4-foot seas inside of Shelikof Strait for Thursday, and northerlies and 3-foot seas there on Friday. You'll notice the winds still holding around 20 knots for most of the northern Pacific, with seas coming up to about 7 to 9 feet. Winds pick up a little bit more down the Bering Sea coast for the Alaska Peninsula, with an easterly wind up to 25 knots and 4-foot seas on Friday. For the Aleutians, north and easterly winds a little more on the variable side for the central and eastern chain. Remember, a big ridge of high pressure has been pushing down here, so this is going to settle out just a little bit more, but the return flow is already showing up here across the western chain. 25 to 30 knots with seas up to 6 to 10 feet on Thursday. And you see them coming up even more on Friday, 14 to 17 feet there, with northerlies kicking in as a front pushes through that western periphery of the ridge. South and westerlies picking up through the central and eastern chain as well as the ridge backs off a little bit more to the east, when we start to see seas up to 7 to 8 feet on the Bering Sea coast and 8 to 11 foot seas expected on the Pacific coast as we get into Friday. For the west coast, north and easterly winds coming down. You'll notice 25 to 30 knot winds there, the strongest of which will be up around Norton Sound. And look at St. Paul and St. George, 15 knots with 6-foot seas expected there. For Friday, look for a south and easterly flow, 15 to 30 knots with the strongest wind shaping up over the Pribilofs at this point. 5-foot seas expected with southeasterlies up to 15 knots over Norton Sound and northeasterlies around St. Lawrence Island, 20 knots with a 7-foot sea. For the north slope now, east and northeasterly winds across the Beaufort Sea coast. You're looking at 25 to 30 there. About the same down for the Chukchi coast with more of a northeasterly turn. As we get into Friday, not a big change. There's still going to be some blowing snow across the region. A north and easterly offshore flow from Wainwright down toward Cape Lisburn and into Kotzebue Sound with that northeast wind. Look for 7-foot seas just south of the Bering Strait and into St. Lawrence Island with that 20-knot wind. A recap of tonight's weather includes winter weather advisories for a large part of the interior along the Yukon Valley and across the north and western coast. That's mainly due to poor visibility that could drop as low as about a half mile or so. And most of the problems that we see across the interior will be up there across the ridge tops and the mountain passes. So most places down in town are not going to have a big problem with poor visibility because of blowing snow. As we look at Juneau tonight, we'll be watching for high winds developing by early tomorrow morning and through most of the day. A Taku wind is expected to develop, but there will be some stronger gusts in Stevens Passage and the Lynn Canal, though they're not reaching storm force. However, gales should be expected. Watch for snow to wind down across south central and shift its focus out towards southwest. You'll see low pressure moving into Bristol Bay and working westward. Meanwhile, a new weather maker is coming in across the central and eastern chain, with rain developing across the Gulf and snow continuing out across the west. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather. See you again tomorrow.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.